to expand on this concept of compatibility, of commonality, there is a positive commandment in the Torah that a Jew has an obligation to emulate God. It is expressed through the words, you must walk in his ways. Now, how does one walk in his ways? Could we be a creator? Factually, we can, to a degree. How do we walk in God's ways? So the Talmud says we must emulate his characteristics, his attributes. How do we know what God's attributes are? How do we know what his characteristics are? In every language, there is a word for God. G-O-D is God. The Almighty is another appellation for God. But in the Hebrew language, there are multiple appellations for God. But how are we aware of what God is? It's beyond our grasp to even relate or even to process correctly who he is, what he is. But rather, he himself communicated to us as part of the written and oral law how he is identified through unpronounceable names, which you're only permitted to pronounce them in certain contexts. One is not permitted to enunciate the name of God in vain, because these are unpronounceable names. But these names connote and convey and communicate God's attributes. For instance, the four-letter name of God, which is known, and it's such a holy name, we don't even say the letters, pronounce the letters as they are. Yud K Vav K, which connotes God is infinite. God was, God is, and God is in the future. This appellation, when it is stated in the Torah, which God is the author and Moshe was only the scribe who committed God's words to parchment. This connotes the attribute of mercy. There is another attribute, which is an unpronounceable name of God, Elokim. This is the attribute of justice. And then there's attributes of kindness and various levels of kindness. For instance, we see at the beginning of the book of Genesis, Adam and Eve are told they're not permitted to eat of the tree of knowledge. When they were put in the Garden of Eden, they were naked. Because of their level of purity, before sin was introduced into existence, their nakedness was not a basis for shame. It was only after they had eaten of the tree of knowledge, the fruit of the tree of knowledge, which the Torah describes as the fruit that contains good and evil, they ingested within their being something which is evil in its essence. That's when they had a sense of shame. Because now, what initially radiated and displayed was only purity and holiness. Now it displayed something which was an intermingling of good and evil. Man became tainted with impurity. Adam and Eve were ashamed of their nakedness. What did God do? He made for them garments to cover that nakedness. This is a kindness. He could have allowed them to remain in a state of shame, but he clothed their nakedness. This is a display of God's kindness. Although it was undeserved. In Hebrew, this is known as chesed. So the Torah begins with displaying God's act of kindness, although it's undeserved kindness. The closing chapter of the 5 books of Moses speaks about the passing of Moses, the teacher of the Jewish people, the most humble man who ever walked the face of the earth. The man, the human being, who was the conduit to transmit God's written and oral law to the Jewish people. The Torah speaks about his passing and how God buried him. Burial, attending to the burial needs of a human being, is an act of kindness. So the Torah begins with displaying and portraying God's kindness, and the closing story of the Torah is God's displaying and showing his kindness through the burial of Moshe. We must emulate his ways, his attributes. His attribute is chesed, indiscriminate kindness. So the Talmud says, just as God clothes the naked, we have Jews, as Jews, must clothe the naked. Just as God buried the dead, we as Jews must bury the dead. And it's at multiple levels. Emulating God's way. But what is the concept? What is the rationale of this positive commandment? Again, it's to create a compatibility, a commonality, that if we assume his characteristics, his attributes, then we've created a common identity. This is in his form and his image. The more we're able to achieve that likeness by creating more goodness. And what is goodness? Goodness is what God himself does and what God himself is. Of course, we have limitations. We cannot be God. But God created us with a potential, with an ability, with an endowment that if we truly take control of our lives and we suppress all the negative inclinations, which only emanate and are a result of the evil of the fruit of the tree of knowledge, which draws us in a direction which is the antithesis of the will of God, then we've achieved that likeness to God, which is his image and his form.